I'm Mr. Vitito. Welcome to lecture number 2 for the Imperialism Unit of U.S. History and Government, New York State Curriculum. Today, lecture number 2, we're going to be looking at the Spanish-American War, causes for, and some of the results and effects of it. We're talking about imperialism, which is a unit that you would have studied in great depth in both grades 9 and 10 for Global Studies 1 and 2. Imperialism is that domination of one country of another in order to take raw materials and to create a marketplace for goods to be sold. And this is something that European nations were doing around the world, and the United States was not involved in imperialism. In fact, we were really the victim of imperialism, having originally started off as colonies of Great Britain. Now, when we finished up with the Revolutionary War, the United States was left in a pretty tough place. Britain no longer was going to be trading with us, and anybody that she could intimidate also was not going to be trading with us. So as a result, the United States was pretty desperate. It's our good fortune, though, that war in Europe actually occupied Spain and the other colonial powers to such a degree that many countries in Latin America were actually able to throw off the yoke of imperialism and also have independence, and they became our trade partners. That was good fortune for us. It was close, it was in our hemisphere, and always the Atlantic Ocean had kind of been a barrier anyways between the American continents and Africa and Europe. So what was going on in the rest of the world, at least in some parts, seemed distant, but there was always the threat that when those wars were over, that those European countries might come back and take over the new trade partners that we had, and that would have been devastating for the American economy. So today in lecture number 2, as we talk about the Spanish-American War, it's important to step back and remember that George Washington had a policy, a foreign policy, that said we won't be involved with other countries except for trade, we won't get involved in military alliances, and that was actually further expanded by President Monroe, who in 1823 issued what's come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, which is nothing more than really his speech to Congress in his State of the Union. But essentially he basically made it clear that Europe was to stay out of the Western Hemisphere and not mess with the countries that we were trading with, but also that they weren't welcome to come and either recolonize former colonies or to come and take over new places. And the two-part promise here on the Monroe Doctrine is that we promise to stay out of European affairs. I don't really think that that made a whole big difference, our impact, because we were a lot more we were a lot more bark than bite. All right, we didn't really have the power to project anything like this. But what we did have was Great Britain, who had the same sorts of feelings toward the Catholic nations of France and Spain, who would have been the two countries maybe most interested in coming back to Latin America, and probably were primed and ready to do so. So the fact that there is a British Navy, the largest navy in the world at the time, patrolling the oceans, who feels the same way we do, it turns out that the Monroe Doctrine kind of sticks all the way through the 1800s. We're rarely challenged. Only toward the end of that century are we ever challenged with the Monroe Doctrine. We're talking about foreign policy when we're talking about the Monroe Doctrine. So just to kind of carry on, you'll recall that number 2 here on my board says Manifest Destiny, okay? And this was the years 1800 to 1870. But we could really look at Manifest Destiny as being an entire unit of study that we did. And of course, we're talking about land that wasn't ours. And just as a quick review, you'll recall that we annexed Texas and we signed treaties for Florida and for Washington, that whole Oregon country area. But we also fought a war, the Mexican-American War, and we took 1/3 of Mexico at the end of that war in 1848. So that's Manifest Destiny. And when we reach the Pacific Ocean, you'd think, well, we've no more place to expand. But not true. The new frontier is going to be what lies across the ocean, and that's going to be Japan. So number 3 on our list today is that Japan is actually opened by the United States of America with something known as an unequal treaty, and this happened in 1853. The unequal treaty was just nothing more than our way of saying, listen, we're not going to conquer you, but you can see what the Spanish are doing down in the Philippines, and do you really want that here? Better to trust us. We know what it's like, and I don't know what kind of a promise there may have been for the future, but I can tell you that in the next 50 years, Japan is going to modernize herself so well that she's going to kick butt on China and the Soviet Union, China and Russia, both in the Russo-Japanese War and the Sino-Japanese War. So Japan's very serious, and if you wonder, Does our opening them up in 1853 with this unequal treaty have anything to do with World War II and Pearl Harbor? Yes, it does. All right. Hey, we're moving on. We're not to the Spanish-American War, which is what this lecture is about, but what we're doing is we're kind of stepping up to seeing that America is getting more and more involved, okay, with what's going on in the world. And we're looking at the West, looking out beyond that Pacific Ocean. There's places that we want to go and places we want to trade. China was that place. All right. In Japan, we saw it more as a coaling station, a place to resupply. That's really what we were looking for from Japan, but it was China that we wanted. So I'm going to turn this back over and look at number 4, and it says that Chinese trade was desired in the years 1898 to 1900, as you can see right here. And these are just some special years because there were a lot of countries already that were involved in carving up China into little spheres. Germany was there, Britain was there, France was there. Of course, all the big names are there, but we're not, because America was really divided about whether we wanted to be involved in something like imperialism. Very, very divided. We had our experience, right? And we didn't want to do that. And as you learned earlier this year, the reason why we have these stars is because we had decided that any land that we were going to conquer, we were going to provide some way for that territory to become in equal standing or equal status with the original 13 states. All right, so having this whole idea of practicing imperialism, it cut against our grain. But you know what? Business is business. So America's going to be thinking real hard about whether we want to practice imperialism or not. Well, meanwhile, while this is happening in China, we can see that the Chinese themselves are not going to like it much, and this Boxer Rebellion is their attempt to throw off this yoke of oppression, okay? And this is going to happen, but it's going to fail. And you wouldn't believe it, but the country that's going to lead the international contingent to put down the Boxer Rebellion is none other than the country I said modernized, Japan. All right? So she's leading with a force of 10,000 soldiers, and she's leading Americans and British and French. She's earning her stripes, as you can see. But Japan's another story, really, although I'll return to Japan one more time. The United States would love to be able to get involved in trade in Japan and make some money, but we don't have a sphere of influence there. So that's what we do here. We actually send something known as the open door notes. This is our open door policy. And we suggest to the nations that are already in China, would you let us trade? That's what the open door notes were. There were notes to these places, to countries like France and Britain and Germany. Would you let us into your sphere so that we can trade? And of course, it is a fail for the United States. All right? Nobody was actually going to do that. Now, the United States is not done with the idea of imperialism, so we're going to see that in 1898, Hawaii is going to be acquired, and you kids have already written about Hawaii, most of you, for the essay that you wrote for my class earlier on in the unit. So we already know the story about Hawaii being acquired, but a little thing you didn't know was how upset Japan was. Apparently she had her eyes on the islands of Hawaii as well. And so angry was she that the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898 that at least a part of her navy steamed around the islands posturing, looking like they were ready to take those islands from us. It didn't happen. There's some kind of a respect, I think, still hanging there in the air between Japan and us, a nation that had kind of forced these unequal treaties on her. But by 1905, those unequal treaties are gone. All right? And Japan has earned her respect, certainly with the United States, but I think even with the world, as far as an Asian nation in this racist world could earn, respect. But enough about Japan today, because we're really talking about Spanish-American War. So what actually were the causes for the war? Well, the war is going to be happening within 2 years of our taking Hawaii. And our good friend Teddy Roosevelt, our eventual president, as the Secretary of the Navy, actually helped to orchestrate some of our naval shipments or movements so that we'd be ready to take on the Spanish, because it was clear that war might be happening. Take a look at this. We've got harsh treatment of the Cubans being reported in our newspaper. And of course, yellow journalism is the style of sensationalizing the news. There was potential profit not being realized in Cuba by American businessmen. So that was certainly something that was making them want to have something happen. So when you have little things like this, like the Bartolome insult, which was a diplomatic insult by one of the Spanish officials in Cuba who sent a letter that somehow became public, and President McKinley was insulted. Well, I don't think he felt insulted, but the American press made a huge deal out of it, right? Getting Americans, on the edge, really wanting to go to war. So when it turns out that we have that the United States naval ship, the USS Maine, sinks in the Bay of Havana. Most people believe the Spanish were involved. It's reported that way. That's more yellow journalism. It's reported that way, and boom, the Spanish-American War has begun. Literally, the president had no choice in this matter. The country was on a war footing. He was either going to lead it or he was going to be led, and a president is not led. All right. So what ends up happening from this? What ends up happening is right here. The United States is not only going to win the war, but we're going to find ourselves controlling these three places: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So that is our lecture today, folks, on the Spanish-American War. Glad you're with me.